I had been living alone for nearly 10 years, in the same house, with routines so familiar I could move through the rooms without thinking. I was 72, retired, no serious illness, no dramatic accident to mark a turning point. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. That is, until that afternoon, when I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, my tea long gone cold, realizing that the conversation that had just ended had quietly shaken everything I believed was stable. No one raised their voice. No one gave orders. The words were wrapped in concern, in love, in phrases like, "just to be safe," and "you don't have to decide right now." But the longer I listened, the more I felt myself being edged out of my own life. No one asked what I wanted. They talked about what made sense, about reasonable options, about plans already laid out, as if my life were a problem to be solved before something went wrong. I nodded. I stayed quiet, and for the first time in years, I felt I was betraying myself through that silence. It wasn't that I was afraid of aging. I was afraid of being seen as someone no longer capable of choosing. I wanted to speak up, to stop the conversation. Yet part of me wondered if I was being selfish, if holding on to my right to decide was worth unsettling the peace of the people I love. As I sat there, caught between those thoughts, my phone vibrated on the table. A message from a number I didn't expect. And then, almost immediately, a knock at the door, slow but firm, arriving at the exact moment when nothing inside me felt settled. If you find yourself leaning in right now, stay with me by liking and subscribing, because what happened next forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about my life. But to understand how an ordinary afternoon led to that moment, we have to go back, much further than you might expect. If you have ever felt that quiet tightening in your chest when people start making plans for your life without really asking you, you might recognize yourself in what I am about to share. After the knock at the door and the unexpected message on my phone, the rest of that afternoon passed in a strange haze. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. I didn't collapse into tears or raise my voice. I washed the mug, wiped the counter, and watched the late light slide across the kitchen floor. But inside, something had shifted. It felt like a small internal alarm had gone off, one I could no longer ignore. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, not the words themselves, but the tone, the certainty with which decisions were being framed as done, as if my role was simply to agree. What unsettled me most was how reasonable it all sounded. There was no villain in the room, no cruelty to point at, just concern, just logic, just people who loved me, wanting to feel reassured. And that made it harder to trust my own discomfort. I asked myself if I was overreacting, if I was clinging to pride, if this was simply what growing older required. That question lingered, heavy and unresolved, as I moved through the rest of my day on autopilot. That night, lying in bed, sleep refused to come. My body was tired, but my mind kept circling the same thought. When did being careful start to feel like being erased? I had spent decades making decisions for others, for my children, for my household, for aging parents of my own. I knew what responsibility looked like. I knew what care looked like. And yet, this felt different. It felt like my voice was being gently lowered, not silenced outright, but slowly turned down until it barely registered. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet I had once cherished. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching a neighbor walk her dog. That simple scene, so ordinary, suddenly felt fragile. I realized how quickly assumptions could solidify into expectations, and how expectations could harden into rules. I wondered how many people before me had drifted into lives they never quite chose, simply because they did not interrupt the process early enough. Over the next few days, small things began to stand out. A comment here, a suggestion there. Nothing alarming on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Someone offering to handle my appointments. Someone else mentioning how much easier it would be if I didn't have to worry about maintenance. Each offer came wrapped in kindness, and each one chipped away at my sense of authorship. I accepted some of them without thinking, then later felt a quiet regret I couldn't fully explain. I started to notice my own reactions, how I hesitated before answering questions, how I softened my opinions to avoid sounding difficult, how I chose silence over clarity because it felt safer in the moment. That realization was uncomfortable. I had always thought of myself as direct, even strong-willed. Yet here I was, editing myself in conversations about my own life. The contradiction sat with me, forcing me to confront a version of myself I hadn't expected to meet. Halfway through that week, I caught myself rehearsing responses in my head before phone calls. Not arguments, just explanations, as if I needed to justify my desire to remain where I was, doing what I was doing. That was when another question surfaced, sharper than the rest. When did wanting to stay myself become something I had to defend? If you have ever practiced words in advance, just to protect a small piece of your independence, you might understand the quiet exhaustion that comes with that habit. I decided to take a walk, hoping movement would settle my thoughts. The air was cool, the streets familiar. Every corner held a memory. This was where I had rushed my kids to school, where I had waved to neighbors over the years. The continuity of it all grounded me, but it also intensified my fear. I wasn't afraid of change itself. I was afraid of change happening without my consent, of waking up one day in a life that no longer felt like an extension of who I was. As I walked, I began to question the story I had been telling myself, that independence meant refusing help, that strength meant managing alone. Those ideas had served me well once, but they were starting to feel incomplete. I could see how easily they could be used against me, twisted into evidence that I was stubborn or unrealistic. The truth was more nuanced. I wasn't rejecting support. I was rejecting invisibility. Later that afternoon, I sat down with a notebook, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote without structure, letting thoughts spill out. What I wanted, what I feared, what I was willing to accept, and what I wasn't. Seeing those words on paper was clarifying. It reminded me that boundaries are not walls. They are definitions. They tell others where care ends and control begins. Writing them down felt like reclaiming a language I had almost forgotten how to speak. Still, doubt lingered. I worried about disappointing people, about being misunderstood, about creating tension where there had been harmony. That inner tug-of-war was relentless. one side urging me to keep the peace, the other insisting that peace built on silence was not peace at all. If you have ever weighed your own comfort against the comfort of those you love, you know how heavy that balance can feel. As days turned into a week, the emotional pressure reached a quiet peak. Nothing exploded. Instead, a sense of urgency settled in. I knew that if I didn't articulate my needs soon, the narrative would continue without me. That realization was both frightening and oddly empowering. It suggested that I still had time, that the story wasn't finished yet, that my voice, though shaken, was still mine to use. One evening during a calm phone call, I tested that voice. I spoke slowly, choosing honesty over reassurance. I said I appreciated the concern. I said I understood the fears. And then I said something that surprised even me. I said I needed to be part of every decision that affected my daily life. Not informed later, not consulted as a formality, truly involved. The line went quiet for a moment. That silence was heavy, but it was also necessary. After the call ended, my hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the release of it. I realized how much energy it takes to suppress yourself, and how freeing it feels to stop. The outcome of that conversation was uncertain, but something inside me had already changed. I had crossed an internal threshold. If you are listening and wondering whether speaking up is worth the discomfort, I can tell you this. The discomfort of honesty fades faster than the discomfort of regret. That night, I slept better than I had in days. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had aligned my actions with my values. The next morning, I woke with a clearer sense of direction. I began to see the situation not as a crisis, but as a crossroads. One path led toward quiet accommodation, the other toward conscious choice. Neither was easy, but only one felt like mine. As this realization settled in, a new layer of reflection emerged. I began to see how easily fear can disguise itself as practicality, and how often older voices are softened in the name of protection. That awareness didn't make me angry. It made me attentive. It made me determined to listen more closely to my instincts, even when they whispered instead of shouted. This was the moment when the story stopped being about what others wanted for me and started becoming about how I wanted to live. The shift was subtle, but profound, and it set the stage for everything that followed, including a choice I never expected to consider, and a conversation that would change the way my family and I understood independence. That turning point, however, did not come out of nowhere. To understand how I arrived there, it helps to look at the patterns I carried long before this moment ever appeared. I began to notice how often my past habits shaped my present reactions. Long before anyone suggested changes to my living situation, I had learned to be accommodating. It was a skill I once took pride in. I could sense what others needed, anticipate concerns, smooth over rough edges before they became conflicts. For most of my life, that ability kept things running. Families stayed together. Problems were managed quietly. But now, in this season of my life, that same instinct was turning against me. It made me easier to manage when what I needed was to be heard. Looking back, I could trace this pattern all the way to my early adulthood. I had married young, raised children, balanced work and home, and learned quickly that being dependable often meant putting my own preferences last. At the time, it felt natural. There was always something more urgent than my own inner voice. Over the years, that voice learned to wait. It learned patience, too much of it. So when the recent conversations unfolded, part of me slipped into that familiar role without realizing it. The role of the reasonable one, the one who doesn't make things harder than they need to be. But aging has a way of stripping away excess. When time feels abundant, compromise feels harmless. When time feels finite, every unchosen choice starts to matter. I began to sense that I was standing at a threshold where continuing to minimize myself would cost more than it once did. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived in pieces, in moments when I caught my reflection and wondered who I was trying to protect by staying quiet. I spent several afternoons alone, intentionally so. I turned down invitations and let calls go to voicemail, not out of resentment, but out of necessity. I needed space to think without adjusting my thoughts to fit someone else's comfort. In that quiet, memories surfaced, times when I had ignored my instincts and later regretted it, times when I had spoken up and weathered the discomfort, only to feel relief afterward. Those memories formed a pattern of their own, one that suggested I already knew the answer I was avoiding. There was also fear, of course, fear of being labeled difficult, fear of appearing ungrateful, fear that asserting myself would fracture relationships that mattered deeply to me. I had seen what happens when families grow tense around aging parents, the unspoken resentments, the careful politeness. I didn't want that future. Yet I began to understand that avoiding tension entirely was not the same as building closeness. Sometimes it only delayed a deeper fracture. One afternoon, while organizing old papers, I came across a handwritten list I had made years ago. Goals, intentions, small promises to myself. Live where you feel at home. Keep your routines sacred. Stay curious. The simplicity of those words struck me. They were not demands, they were guides, and I had honored them for a long time. Seeing them again reminded me that my current resistance was not new stubbornness. It was continuity. It was me trying to remain consistent with the life I had already built. As I reflected on this, I started paying closer attention to the language being used around me. Words like safer, easier, better, all well-meaning, all vague. Rarely did anyone ask what those words meant to me. I realized how easily general ideas of safety can override individual definitions of well-being. Safety to me was not the absence of risk. It was the presence of choice. That distinction felt crucial, yet it was one I hadn't articulated clearly before. If you are listening and feel a familiar tension between what others consider best and what feels right to you, I invite you to pause for a moment and ask yourself whose definition you have been living by. That question, once asked, is hard to set aside. Around this time, I agreed to meet a friend for lunch. She was a few years older than me, sharp-minded, observant. We talked about ordinary things at first. Then the conversation drifted, as it often does, toward aging. I mentioned my recent experience, carefully, without dramatizing it. She listened quietly, then said something that stayed with me. She said, "People don't mean to take your power. They just fill the space when you don't claim it. That sentence landed softly, but it carried weight. It reframed the situation entirely. I had been viewing myself as pushed, but perhaps I had also stepped back. Not intentionally, not consciously, but through habit. That perspective did not assign blame. It assigned agency. And agency, I was learning, was something I could still exercise. After that lunch, I began to experiment with small acts of clarity. Not confrontation, clarity. When someone offered to take over a task, I paused before answering. When plans were suggested, I asked questions instead of nodding along. These were subtle shifts, but they changed the dynamic. People responded differently when I spoke from a place of calm certainty rather than defensiveness. I could feel my footing returning, one interaction at a time. Still, there were moments of doubt. Nights when I replayed conversations and wondered if I had gone too far. Mornings when the old urge to smooth things over resurfaced. Change, even internal change, is rarely linear. But each time I resisted the impulse to retreat, I felt a small reinforcement, a reminder that my comfort mattered too. Midway through this process, another conversation arose, this one more direct. It wasn't planned, it emerged naturally, almost inevitably. I found myself explaining not just what I wanted, but why it mattered. I spoke about dignity, about identity, about the difference between support and substitution. As I spoke, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't asking for permission. I was sharing information. That shift altered the tone entirely. If you have ever struggled to explain your needs without feeling defensive, you may recognize how powerful that distinction can be. It turns a debate into a dialogue. The response was mixed, some understanding, some hesitation, some lingering concern. But it was honest. And honesty, even when imperfect, felt healthier than quiet compliance. I stopped framing the situation as a loss to be avoided and started seeing it as a transition to be shaped. That mental shift eased much of my resistance. It allowed me to engage more openly without the constant fear of being overruled. And it prepared me for a decision that would soon present itself, one that forced me to test everything I thought I understood about control, trust, and letting others in. Before that decision arrived, however, there was one more layer of resistance I had to confront. It lived quietly inside me, disguised as responsibility. The belief that my choices should minimize inconvenience for others. Letting go of that belief was not easy, but it was necessary. Because a life designed solely around not burdening anyone else is, in its own way, a form of disappearance. As this realization settled, I could feel the ground shifting beneath me again. Not in a destabilizing way, but in a way that suggested movement, forward movement. The path ahead was still unclear, but I was no longer standing still. And as events continued to unfold, I would soon be asked to make a choice that tested whether I truly believed what I had begun to claim. The moment that tested me did not arrive with drama or urgency. It came quietly, almost politely, which in some ways made it harder to face. A suggestion was made, framed as an option, delivered with care. It was presented as flexible, temporary, reversible. All the right words were used, and yet as I listened, I felt that familiar tightening return, not as sharp as before, but unmistakable. It was the sense that if I agreed without clarity, the shape of my life would begin to change in ways that would be difficult to undo. I asked for time. That alone felt like progress. In the past, I might have responded immediately, eager to reassure. This time, I allowed the space. During those days of waiting, I noticed how often I measured my thoughts against imagined reactions. I caught myself thinking, they'll worry if I say this, or they'll be relieved if I say that. It was revealing to see how quickly my internal compass could be pulled off course by the anticipation of someone else's feelings. I began to separate two questions that I had previously treated as one. What do I need? And what are others afraid of? They often overlap, but they are not the same. Untangling them took patience. I realized that much of the pressure I felt was rooted in other people's anxiety, not my own limitations. Understanding that did not make their concern invalid, but it did help me see that accommodating fear is not the same as making a wise choice. I spent one afternoon imagining different futures, not catastrophes, just ordinary days. Waking up in a place that wasn't mine, following schedules I didn't set, or, alternatively, waking up where I was, with support woven in quietly, on my terms. The contrast was instructive. One future felt smaller, even if it promised safety. The other felt adaptable, alive. That exercise clarified something essential. My resistance was not about location or logistics. It was about agency. If you're listening and picturing your own future as it's being discussed by others, notice which version allows you to breathe more fully. That sensation is information worth paying attention to. As I continued reflecting, another layer surfaced, one I hadn't expected. Guilt. Not guilt about burdening others, but guilt about wanting more say than seemed reasonable at my age. I had absorbed, without realizing it, the idea that independence has an expiration date, that at some point asserting preferences becomes indulgent. Challenging that belief was uncomfortable. It forced me to examine where I had learned it and why I had accepted it so readily. I thought of women I had known who faded into the background of their own lives, not because they were incapable, but because it was easier to comply. Their needs became secondary, then optional, then invisible. I remembered promising myself I wouldn't do that, and yet here I was, negotiating how much of myself I was allowed to keep. The conversation I had been postponing eventually took place. It was longer than planned. There were pauses, clarifications, moments of tension that didn't resolve neatly. I spoke about wanting support without surrender, about how being included in decisions mattered more to me than any specific outcome. I tried not to argue facts. I focused on feelings, on lived experience. That choice changed the tone. It made the conversation less about convincing and more about understanding. Halfway through, I noticed something shift, not just in them, but in me. I was no longer bracing for resistance. I was grounded. That steadiness surprised me. It felt earned, and it marked a subtle turning point. I realized I was no longer reacting to proposals. I was articulating a framework, a way of thinking about aging that centered my voice. If you have ever wondered whether it's possible to express boundaries without creating distance, this moment taught me that it is, but only when those boundaries are rooted in self-respect rather than fear. After that discussion, the immediate pressure eased. Not everything was resolved, but the dynamic had changed. I felt less like a subject of concern and more like a participant in planning. That distinction mattered. It restored a sense of balance that had been missing. In the days that followed, I reflected on how close I had come to agreeing simply to avoid discomfort. The realization was sobering. It reminded me that transitions often happen not through dramatic decisions, but through small, unexamined concessions. Each one seems harmless. Together, they can quietly reroute a life. This awareness led me to consider alternatives more seriously, not as compromises, but as intentional designs. I explored ways support could be integrated without overwhelming my routines. I spoke to people who had navigated similar choices. Their stories varied, but a common thread emerged. Those who felt content had one thing in common. They had defined their terms early. That insight was empowering. It suggested that the quality of the outcome depended less on the option chosen and more on the clarity with which it was chosen. Independence, I saw, was not preserved by resisting change, but by shaping it deliberately. As I sat with this understanding, another opportunity arose, unexpected and unsettling. An offer that seemed, on the surface, to address many concerns. It was generous, thoughtful, and it came from someone whose opinion I valued deeply. Accepting it would mean altering my daily life in tangible ways. Declining it would mean reaffirming my current path with all its uncertainties. This was the emotional pivot point I hadn't anticipated, the place where theory met reality. I felt torn, not between right and wrong, but between comfort and conviction. One choice promised ease, the other promised continuity of self. The weight of that decision settled heavily on me. If you have ever stood at a crossroads where both paths look reasonable, yet only one feels true, you know how isolating that moment can be. I took time again, more time than anyone expected. I needed to listen beneath the noise of opinions, including my own. I paid attention to how my body responded when I imagined saying yes, and how it responded when I imagined saying no. The difference was subtle but consistent. One brought a sense of relief tinged with resignation. The other brought anxiety paired with relief. That pairing told me something important. Choosing yourself does not always feel calming at first. Sometimes it feels unsettling, precisely because it disrupts familiar patterns. Recognizing that helped me trust the discomfort rather than flee from it. When I finally made my decision, it was not dramatic. I spoke calmly. I explained my reasoning. I acknowledged the care behind the offer, and I declined. Not permanently, not absolutely, but clearly. The response was quieter than I had feared. There was disappointment, yes, confusion, but there was also respect, more than I expected. That moment marked a true turning point, not because the external situation changed overnight, but because I proved something to myself. I proved that I could tolerate the discomfort of disappointing others without abandoning my own needs. That realization reshaped my sense of capability more than any practical adjustment could have. As the days passed, the intensity faded. What remained was a steadier confidence. I began to trust myself again, not as someone clinging to the past, but as someone actively authoring the next chapter. This shift influenced everything that followed, including how I approached support, how I communicated boundaries, and how I envisioned aging, not as a narrowing, but as a refinement. Near the end of this phase, I found myself reflecting on a question I hadn't asked before. What would it look like to accept help without shrinking? That question became a bridge, leading me toward possibilities I had previously dismissed. Possibilities that required openness as well as clarity. As I prepared to explore those options, I sensed that the hardest internal work had already been done. The next steps would involve logistics, conversations, adjustments. But the core decision had been made. I would not disappear quietly from my own life. This understanding did not arrive all at once. It emerged through hesitation, missteps, and moments of doubt. And it set the foundation for the next stage of my journey, one where I would test how this renewed sense of agency could coexist with the realities of aging and interdependence. What followed surprised me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quieter than I expected. After I declined the offer, life did not collapse into chaos. No one withdrew their care, no doors closed. Instead, there was a brief period of adjustment, a recalibration of expectations. I noticed how much of my fear had been built on imagined consequences rather than real ones. That realization was humbling. It showed me how often we negotiate against scenarios that exist only in our minds. With the immediate tension eased, a different challenge emerged. I had asserted myself, but now I needed to live inside the choice I had made. Independence, once claimed, still required maintenance. It asked me to be honest about my limits, not just my boundaries. That honesty was harder than saying no. It meant acknowledging where I genuinely needed support and where I simply needed reassurance. I began experimenting, cautiously. I allowed help in specific areas, but I stayed involved in how it was arranged. I noticed the difference immediately. When assistance arrived as something I had chosen, it felt like reinforcement. When it arrived uninvited, it felt intrusive. The contrast taught me something essential. Control does not require doing everything yourself. It requires consent. This period was not without friction. There were misunderstandings, moments when I felt I had to restate myself, sometimes more than once. That repetition was tiring. It made me wonder if asserting autonomy would always require this much effort. Yet each time I clarified my needs, the process became slightly easier. I was building a new muscle, one I hadn't exercised consistently before. As weeks passed, I noticed a shift in how people spoke to me. The tone changed subtly. Suggestions became questions. Plans became discussions. That change did not happen because I demanded it. It happened because I modeled it. I stopped signaling uncertainty about my own authority. In response, others adjusted. This dynamic reinforced a lesson I had overlooked for years. People often take cues from the confidence we show in our own choices. Still, there were moments of loneliness. Independence can be isolating when misunderstood. There were days when I wondered if it would be simpler to surrender, to let others take the lead. Those thoughts usually surfaced when I was tired or overwhelmed. I learned to recognize them not as truths, but as signals. Signals that I needed rest, connection, or reassurance, not disappearance. During one particularly reflective afternoon, I sat with a cup of coffee and asked myself a difficult question. What was I actually trying to preserve? Was it my house, my routines, or something deeper? The answer came slowly but clearly. I was protecting my sense of continuity, the feeling that my life still made sense to me, that the thread connecting who I had been to who I was becoming had not been cut. If you are listening and wondering whether your resistance is about a place or a principle, it may help to ask what continuity means to you. Sometimes the answer reveals more than any practical consideration ever could. As I continued navigating this new balance, another realization emerged. Independence is often framed as a solitary achievement. In reality, it is relational. It depends on how others see us, but also on how we present ourselves. When I stopped presenting myself as someone who might need to be persuaded, conversations shifted. That change was subtle but powerful. There was a particular evening that marked another emotional turning point for me. I was on the phone discussing future possibilities, and for the first time I heard myself say, "This is what works for me right now." Not defensively, not apologetically, just factually. When the words left my mouth, I felt a wave of calm. It was as if I had finally given myself permission to exist in the present rather than constantly preparing for a hypothetical future. That moment crystallized something important. I was no longer negotiating my worth based on potential decline. I was asserting it based on current reality. That shift in perspective changed how I experienced everything else. Decisions felt less urgent. Conversations felt less loaded. I was no longer rushing to secure my place in my own life. I was inhabiting it. If this moment resonates with you, if you have ever felt relief simply by naming what is true for you right now, it may be worth reflecting on how often you give yourself that permission. From that point on, my approach became more intentional. I started defining what support meant to me in practical terms. I created clear agreements. I communicated preferences early, before assumptions could form. This proactive stance reduced friction significantly. It also gave me a sense of partnership rather than dependency. Yet, even with these improvements, I encountered internal resistance. Old habits resurfaced under stress, the urge to appease, the instinct to minimize. Change is not a straight line, especially when it involves unlearning patterns formed over decades. I learned to meet these moments with patience rather than judgment. Each time I noticed myself slipping, I gently corrected course. One of the most profound changes occurred internally. I stopped measuring my success by how little I needed others. Instead, I measured it by how aligned my choices felt. That metric was more forgiving and more accurate. It allowed for vulnerability without equating it with weakness. Near the end of this phase, I found myself in another conversation that once would have triggered anxiety. This time, I felt grounded. I listened. I responded thoughtfully. And when I sensed the discussion drifting toward conclusions that did not sit right with me, I intervened calmly. The outcome was not perfect, but it was respectful. That respect mattered more than agreement. This was the emotional pivot I hadn't anticipated. The realization that asserting myself did not require conflict. It required clarity. And clarity, once established, tended to sustain itself. That insight reshaped my understanding of strength. Strength was no longer endurance, it was presence. As I moved forward, I began considering possibilities that blended independence with connection more creatively. Options I had previously dismissed as compromises now appeared as collaborations. The fear that had once narrowed my thinking began to loosen its grip. I was no longer choosing between autonomy and support. I was learning how they could coexist. If you find yourself approaching a similar crossroads, it may help to question the assumption that only one value can survive. Often, the real work lies in redefining the terms rather than selecting a side. Toward the end of this chapter, I felt a new kind of readiness. Not the readiness to give something up, but the readiness to expand, to explore arrangements that honored my need for agency while acknowledging the benefits of shared responsibility. This openness marked a significant shift from where I had started. I could see now that the earlier conflict had served a purpose. It had forced me to articulate what mattered before circumstances made the decision for me. That clarity became a compass, guiding subsequent choices with less friction and more confidence. As I stood on the edge of the next phase, I understood that the journey was far from over. Aging does not offer final answers, only evolving questions. But I felt equipped to engage with those questions on my own terms. Near the close of this period, I found myself reflecting on something simple yet profound. Independence is not a destination. It is a practice, one that requires attention, communication, and self-trust. Maintaining it would require ongoing effort, but it was effort I was now willing to invest. If you have stayed with me through this part of the story, consider what independence looks like in your own life today, not as an ideal, but as a lived experience. That reflection may prepare you for the transitions ahead. As this chapter drew to a close, I sensed that the most difficult internal work had been completed. What remained was the practical exploration of new ways of living that aligned with this hard-won clarity. The next stage would test how these insights held up when applied to real-world arrangements and deeper forms of interdependence. That exploration and the unexpected lessons it brought would reshape my understanding even further, leading me toward a solution I never would have considered at the beginning of this journey. By the time I reached this point, my perspective had shifted enough that I could look at new possibilities without immediately labeling them as threats. What once felt like compromise now felt like design. I wasn't searching for a way out of my life anymore. I was searching for a way to support it. That distinction changed how I evaluated every option placed in front of me. One idea kept resurfacing, not as a solution offered by others, but as a thought I returned to on my own. What if independence didn't mean staying exactly where I was, exactly as things were? What if it meant choosing how connection entered my life, rather than keeping it at a distance? That question lingered, challenging my earlier assumptions. I began speaking with people whose lives looked different from mine, but not diminished. Women my age who lived with someone else by choice, not necessity. Some shared homes with longtime friends. Others lived in arrangements that allowed privacy alongside shared responsibility. What struck me was not the structure of their lives, but their tone when they spoke about them. There was no defensiveness, no apology, just a quiet sense of ownership. Listening to their stories, I noticed how often fear had shaped my imagination more than reality. I had pictured loss of privacy, loss of control, loss of self. What they described instead was negotiation, conversation, adjustment. Imperfect, yes, but intentional. Their experiences didn't erase my concerns, but they softened their edges. As I explored these ideas, I paid close attention to my internal responses. Some options felt immediately wrong. Others felt intriguing but unsettling. I learned to distinguish between discomfort that signaled danger and discomfort that signaled growth. That distinction became one of my most valuable tools. I also confronted another truth. Independence had become part of my identity. Letting it evolve felt like a personal risk. Who would I be if I wasn't the one managing everything alone? That question unsettled me more than any logistical concern. It forced me to examine how tightly I had tied my sense of worth to self-sufficiency. There was a day when this question came into sharp focus. I was having a conversation about potential future arrangements, and I heard myself say, "I don't want to need anyone." The words surprised me. They sounded absolute, almost rigid. When the conversation ended, I sat with that statement. Did I truly believe that needing others was something to avoid? Or was that belief simply familiar? I realized then that much of my resistance was rooted in an outdated definition of strength, one that equated independence with isolation. That definition had served me once, but it no longer fit the life I was living. Letting it go felt like shedding an old layer, one that had become restrictive. If you are listening and recognize a belief you have carried for years, beginning to feel too small, it may be worth asking whether it still serves the person you are now. Gradually, I allowed myself to imagine a version of my life that included shared rhythms. Not constant togetherness, but reliable presence. Someone else in the house, or nearby. Someone whose life intersected with mine in practical, respectful ways. The idea no longer felt like surrender. It felt like collaboration. This shift did not erase uncertainty. There were still questions about boundaries, finances, expectations. But those questions felt manageable now that they were framed around choice rather than obligation. I was no longer bracing against change. I was shaping it. One afternoon, while reviewing notes I had made over the weeks, I noticed how often the word control appeared. I had been fighting for control, but what I truly wanted was authorship, the ability to say, this is how my life is arranged, and this is why. That realization simplified many decisions. It gave me a clear standard against which to measure options. When a concrete opportunity finally presented itself, I approached it differently than I would have months earlier. I asked specific questions. I outlined what mattered to me. I stated what I was open to and what I wasn't. There was negotiation, there was adjustment, and there was something else too, mutual respect. Accepting this arrangement did not feel like giving something up. It felt like making room. Room for support that didn't overshadow me. Room for connection that didn't dilute my identity. The fear that once dominated my thinking had not vanished, but it no longer controlled the conversation. As this new chapter began to take shape, I paid close attention to my emotional state. I noticed moments of relief, moments of apprehension, moments of unexpected gratitude. I also noticed how much energy I had been spending resisting change, energy that was now available for other things: creativity, curiosity, rest. One evening, as I reflected on the journey so far, I recognized a subtle but profound change. I no longer felt as though time was closing in on me. I felt as though it was opening into something more nuanced. Aging, I realized, was not a narrowing of options. It was a refinement of priorities. This understanding brought a sense of peace I hadn't anticipated. Not because everything was settled, but because I trusted myself to navigate what wasn't. That trust had been the missing piece all along. If you find yourself at a stage where old definitions no longer fit and new ones haven't fully formed, know that this in-between space is not failure. It is transition. As I settled into this new arrangement, I encountered challenges. Adjustments took time. Communication required effort. There were moments when I missed the simplicity of complete solitude. I allowed myself to feel that without interpreting it as regret. Missing one thing does not negate the value of another. What surprised me most was how much my sense of self remained intact. I still made decisions. I still shaped my days. The presence of another did not erase me. It mirrored me in ways that revealed new aspects of who I was becoming. Near the end of this phase, I reflected on the initial fear that had started everything, the fear of losing control. In hindsight, I could see that fear more clearly. It was never about where I lived or who helped me. It was about being seen, being respected, being included as the central character in my own life. That fear had led me through doubt, resistance, and difficult conversations. It had also led me to clarity. I understood now that independence is not something others grant or take away. It is something you practice through conscious choice. If you are listening and wondering whether it is too late to redefine how you live, I want you to know this: it is not. The ability to choose does not disappear with age. It only changes form. As this part of my story comes to a close, I find myself standing on firmer ground than before. Not because the path ahead is simple, but because it is mine. The work of aligning my life with my values continues, but it no longer feels like a battle. What lies ahead will involve further adjustments, deeper conversations, and ongoing negotiation between autonomy and connection. But those challenges no longer intimidate me. They invite me to stay engaged, attentive, and honest. If you have followed this journey and feel echoes of your own questions in it, take a moment to reflect on what kind of life you are actively choosing right now. That awareness alone can be the beginning of meaningful change. The story does not end here. It evolves. And in the final part, I want to share what this journey ultimately taught me about dignity, freedom, and the quiet power of choosing your own terms, even when the world expects you to shrink. Now, when I look at my life, it feels quieter in a way that is not empty, but settled. My days have a rhythm that belongs to me. I wake up knowing where I am and why I chose it. There is support around me, but it does not press in on me. I make decisions without rushing. I accept help without feeling smaller. Nothing about my life is perfect, but it feels honest. That sense of honesty has brought a kind of freedom I didn't know I was missing. The crisis passed not because everything became easy, but because I stopped fighting myself. What this journey taught me did not arrive as a single realization. It formed slowly, through missteps and moments of clarity. I learned that independence is not about resisting change, but about participating in it consciously. I learned that safety without voice can quietly drain the spirit, while support chosen on your own terms can restore it. I learned that boundaries are not acts of defiance. They are acts of self-knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that aging does not mean surrendering authorship of your life. It means rewriting it with greater intention. If you are listening to this and carrying the weight of being misunderstood, dismissed, or emotionally silenced, I want you to hear this clearly. What you feel makes sense. Wanting respect does not mean you are ungrateful. Wanting choice does not mean you are difficult. And needing help does not erase your worth. Many of us were taught to endure quietly, to keep peace at our own expense, especially within family. But your inner life matters. Your comfort matters. Your voice matters, even now, even here. Healing does not require pretending everything was fine. It begins when you allow yourself to name what was missing and decide what you deserve moving forward. You do not have to rush this process. You do not have to explain yourself perfectly. Small steps count. Pauses count. Listening to your own instincts counts. Wherever you are in your journey, you are not late. You are arriving. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to stay connected and share your thoughts, because the next conversation builds on this one and explores what it really means to live with dignity on your own terms.